4 and then 3.5 hours. That might work.
Right at the end of the
Yeah,
day.
that might work. You now understand my reluctance to tell you who you're going to call.
But you've been
The fluidity with which it changes.
It's still helpful.
I know, no, we're happy to do it, but I just want, you just can't rely on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll stay here.
No, I want you to just move on.
Okay.
We're, because I think we're going to, how he's going to. Yeah. I mean, schedules are pretty complicated.
I'd say the facility is working on it.
Yeah, 2 months later.
God, I hope not. I don't think Carolyn wants to stay in there.
Oh, God. Is she still in there?
I haven't heard they got her off yet, so.
for these?
No.
Okay, so.
We've got
have a
time,
minute.
it'll probably be after lunch.
All right, cool.
Thank you, sorry.
Makes a difference on if I have to move.
Yeah, no, you're good.
All right,
Oh, wait a second.
court is again in session.
Thank you, please. Is that sidebar on the record?
Yeah, the sidebar beforehand was, before Officer Bro, I wanted to let the court know that we were ready with him and asked the court's permission if I could leave the courtroom for a moment or two during that.
It's on the record.
Oh, yeah, then, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm sorry,
No problem.
something happened and I had to go back there.
What happened?
You okay? Oh, great. Yes, we're back in session, courtroom's open. Court, we did have a sidebar after Peterson's testimony before Mr. Bro's, and frankly, it was simply to advise the court that Mr. Bro would be called, Mr. Langdon would be doing that, and to accommodate a scheduling issue with our next witness if the court minded if I left the courtroom for a few minutes during Bro's testimony. The court was all too eager to allow me to leave the courtroom, perhaps disappointed I came back. But, so the record's clear. During that testimony, I think I left to resolve an issue with the officer, with the doctor, for about a minute or maybe 2 or 3 minutes twice. So that's what that sidebar was.
Thank you, counsel. So all the issues resolved around the doctor this morning?
That is also correct.
All right. Ready for the jury?
We're ready to proceed.
Bring them up, please.
Oh.
The one that's up there.
That's yours.
Let me do it.
Yeah, you're in charge of that.
All right.
Please be seated. Folks, I'm going to need just a moment, please. I'm going to have you return back to the jury. I'll get you
All right.
as quickly as possible. Go ahead. So I was informed by my law clerk that juror number 1 did not come in with his notebook, which if anybody has been paying attention, he hasn't had. Mr. Stern indicated and made that observation to my law clerk that juror number 1 did not have a notepad.
Actually, I mean, Mr. Juror number 1 is closest to me when he got in was 3 feet away and said out loud, "Oh, I forgot my notebook," to which I just passed that message on to defense counsel and to Sarah, and if anybody wanted to do anything about it, that's all.
I've seen him with it, I've seen him without it.
Well,
So the way to deal with that is to send him back out. If he wants to bring it in, he can bring it in. If he doesn't want to bring it in, he doesn't need to bring it in.
and it wasn't my observation, it was his articulation loud enough for me to hear it. I told Sarah and defense counsel.
All right.
This, what you've done will have just solved the problem.
Get the jury, please.
All right.
All right, thank you. Please be seated.
Thank you. State call with Dr. Joel Andre. Once you come up here, the judge will stop you in just a second.
Morning. Raise your right hand, please. You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you about to give us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I do. You see the pastor with.
Hi. Sir, tell these folks who you are.
I'm Joel Andre. I'm Director of Neurological MRI at Harborview Medical Center.
Now, the first thing
Did you
is
MRI, that's correct.
we're going to ask you to talk a little louder. That microphone may reach, but if they can't hear you, it doesn't do any good. So, and how do you spell both your first and last name?
First name is Jalal. Last name is Andre, Andre.
And when you said you're the director of, well, you tell me again.
Neurological MRI
What does that mean?
means that, well, so we have 3 MRI systems or scanners in our hospital, and I'm the director of coordinating the activities, also selecting the sequences, basically everything that has to do with organizing and orchestrating the MRI. I'm also the MRI safety officer.
What is an MRI?
So so basically if you think of a donut, it's like a long donut with a tube in it, and basically it uses radio frequency energy to deposit in tissues, and then we listen to echoes and then reconstruct images from that. It's a commonly used medical device.
And you said you're the safety officer as well. Does that have to do with controlling how much?
That has to do with just identifying potential areas where patients might get injured from the equipment itself.
And you are connected with Harborview. Describe for us as far as the trauma services that Harborview Hospital provides in Northwest.
Sure. So Harborview is the only level 1 trauma center in the entire state of Washington, as well, and also serves 5 states, the WWAMI states, including Alaska. Anyway, there's 5 of them in total. We see, I'd say, literally probably 1,000 plus traumas a year, if not more. We see quite a lot. We see the worst because everything gets kind of flown in or shipped in from other places. I've seen axe versus face, bear versus human. I've seen a lot of things. So.
How long have you been at Harborview?
5 years.
And are you also connected with the University of Washington?
I am an assistant professor at the University of Washington. My primary faculty appointment is at the University of Washington. I have clinical services both at Harborview Medical Center and at the University of Washington Medical Center.
On a day-in, day-out basis, what do you do?
So pretty much my entire day is spent, so there are clinical days where I actually see patients or read MRIs or CAT scans, CT exams, for example. And those days are spent reading usually on the order of 80 to 100 what we call cross-sectional imaging studies, so that would be CT and MRI. And then part of my time is also spent doing research, so I do research on developing MRI sequences.
And I want to make sure we understand what the word sequences mean. I know we'll get into it in some detail in a few minutes, but give us a little primer about how the MRI works with the use of this sequencing.
So sequences are essentially the way that we play out the deposition of energy and then listen back with the echoes. So it's simply a way to derive information, and we have different ways that we, if you will, it's like talking about creating music. For example, you have various notes, various instruments, conjunction or coordination that you then can create music. It's a similar analogy. But the exams here are all CT exams, and so MRI is probably a little less related to that per se.
And what's the difference between CT and MRI?
So CT is just another modality for imaging. In this case, we use X-ray, and so it's basically an X-ray tube that spins around the patient. It's a similar kind of a donut configuration. The patient is in the middle of the donut. The CT device spins around, and literally thousands of revolutions per minute, and acquires imaging data using X-rays.
What does that data end up looking like? What value is it to a guy like you?
Sure. So there's different technologies that are in play. We have, for example, a dual energy CT scanner, which allows us to Sure. We have a dual energy CT scanner that allows us to differentiate and actually identify calcium, for example. So we can then say this is definitely bone. There's no question about it. It's actually we are identifying the atomic number, if you will, of the bone itself. And we can identify calcium. So CT gives you quite a lot of power in being able to differentiate soft tissue from bone. For example, we can see the structure, the morphology, if you will. We can see fractures in bones, for example. We can see soft tissue swelling. We can differentiate fat from blood, and lots of other things.
Are there slightly different safety issues with CTs as opposed to MRIs?
Yes. So with CT, there's the potential risk that you could, with too many X-rays, for example. Some of you may have seen years ago, I think Cedars-Sinai, for example, had issues with radiation-induced burns to the head from CT scanning. So we obviously are very careful about that and use only a minimal amount of radiation to derive images. So we can reconstruct, again, the data from this image, from the essentially X-ray deposition.
So let me go back again to, on a day-in, day-out basis, you review CT scans?
Yes.
And is that for, in essence, anyone at Harborview who requests a neurological CT scan, you'd be involved? Or you would potentially?
If I'm the person there that day, I'm the one who ultimately is, I'm the attending physician, so the person who ultimately signs off on the report and essentially, renders a final diagnosis.
You got involved with doing some reviewing CT scans, a whole series of them, for a woman named Brenda Welch back in November of 2014, is that right?
That's correct.
And you were you the one who reviewed them, authored reports, and is familiar with the injuries that they reflect?
Yes, I am.
I want you to help us a little bit, and were most of these on the head, or all of these are on the head, I guess?
Primarily on the head. There were a few other parts of the body that I was not really, that I was not involved in interpreting.
Because you said you're neurological, so tell us what that means.
So that means that in general I review studies that are done of basically everything from the skull, to basically the head to the spine. So basically the entire brain, head and neck region, and then spine.
I'm going to ask you to interpret some of those or share some of your findings, but so the jury has a little more idea about you.
Sure.
You're a medical doctor?
Yes.
Where'd you go to medical school?
Drexel College of Medical School. Drexel University College of Medicine. Drexel University College of Medicine.
And after medical school, did you do some kind of a fellowship?
Yes, I was at Stanford University in California.
And was that doing the same type of work?
That was specifically in neuroradiology, which is what I do. So I'm a diagnostic neuroradiologist.
And you were there for how long?
That was a 2-year fellowship.
And from there?
So it was actually before then. I had a year of internship at Albert Einstein Medical Center in Philadelphia. Albert Einstein Medical Center in Philadelphia. And then 4 years of residency in diagnostic radiology at Monmouth Medical Center in New Jersey.
And from there?
And then I went to Stanford, and then I began working at the University of Washington.
Explain to us a little bit, to the extent that it's relevant, so the jury understands, sort of the composition of the head. Give us sort of a verbal tour of what happens to protect the brain to the skull. Can you do that?
Sure. So basically, I mean, obviously there's, generally there's skin, which just kind of protects from abrasion. Then deep to that is usually fat or some kind of, everybody has a little bit of fat, and that fat is just really meant as a cushion. Deep to that, different parts of the skull, depending on where you are, have muscle. Like the temporalis muscle, for example, extends up, helps to chew, but also extends up to a large majority of the head, but also that muscle helps to protect from injury. And then there's the, what I like to call the egg, because it really is like a bit of an egg. It's an oblong, kind of a spherical shape, which is the cranium itself. And it's pretty fantastic what the skull can withstand in terms of injury. And really the goal is just to protect the contents inside the egg. So if you think about just like you would cooking, it takes a certain force to impact or to crack open the egg. And presumably that's protecting the contents inside.
And the contents inside this egg, to use your analogy, is the brain.
Right.
Is the shell of the egg have a particular term?
So there's a term called the calvarium, which is essentially the set of bones that we use medically. That's our term to describe the multiple bones that comprise the skull itself. It's actually made of several bones that are connected by sutures. It's probably a little too much detail, but basically that's the way it evolves.
And with the work that you do and the training you've had, the experience you've had, are you able to teach us things about the level of force that would be necessary to break certain levels of the skull? Right,
that's true. Yes. I mean, just because, obviously I mentioned before, but...
Objection, non-responsive.
Another question. So do you have the ability to teach us things about the amount of force that would be necessary to break certain parts? And again, is that what you do in essence, a day in, day out basis?
Yes.
Tell us what you were asked to do in examining Brenda Welch and the CAT scans of her head and neck on, well, actually, let me withdraw that. How many different sets of images did you review in this case?
Are you asking for the actual image number or the number of exams?
The number of exams, thank you.
There were 3 exams.
Okay. And were 2 of them on the same day?
Yes.
And what was that date?
That was November 16th, 2014.
And was there a third exam the following day?
Yes.
Okay. Did you put together to help us a little bit of a series of slides? Well, let me go back a moment. What is produced visually for other folks to look at from these CAT scans? In other words, what do we look at? I mean, we've all probably seen an X-ray of an arm or something, but is this different?
Well, yes, it is different. It's a 3-dimensional reconstruction. And so an X-ray is just a 2-dimensional projection. So if you hold up your hand and you have an X-ray, you're basically just there's a film, and the X-rays are basically shot through the hand, and then you get the exposure. So you have just a 2-dimensional projection, which doesn't allow you to, kind of reconstruct a lot of data other than what's in the projection itself. A CT scan, on the other hand, like I said, it spirals around the patient, and as the patient is on a table that moves, and during that time, basically the CT then is reconstructing a three-dimensional data set. And so we're able to then interrogate, able to essentially go through that data set in multiple projections. So we can, if you think about it like an orange, we can cut it into multiple sections and multiple planes. And we can do that without actually injuring the orange, if you will. So, the beautiful thing about imaging, and the reason why I love it, is because you don't need a scalpel to look inside the body. So it's pretty fantastic in essence.
And did you put together a series of images to reflect the injuries that you saw to Brenda?
Yes.
And I laid before you a series of exhibits. They're numbered on the back from numbers 47 to 61. Nope, right off the top of the head. Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
Yes. And if you would take a quick look, those are things that you've chosen as representing the best views of Ms. Welch.
Yes.
And did you prepare all of those?
I did.
And are those, do they contain in a visual form, the form that we could look at, an accurate depiction of the injuries that you saw to Brenda from the CC?
Yes.
And they're all accurate?
Yes.
I would offer exhibits 47 to 61 inclusive.
Your Honor, I would object to those being entered. No objection to their use for illustrative purposes. Those images have markings on them.
I'll allow 47 through 61 to be admitted.
Let me start with number 47, if you would. And Sarah, if you would. So this is the first slide you presented, and this, I asked you how many different times she was examined. Is this what, does this teach us that?
Yes, those are the 3 examinations, and the exact times that they were required, which are the numbers here.
So let's just make sure we're tracking. What is A? What does that mean?
So a CT angiogram is, so specifically a CT angiography is where we inject contrast into a vein, and then that contrast essentially goes to the brain. And so we're just using a contrast agent to try and identify or differentiate vessels from other areas of the brain. But it's specifically of the head and neck region, meaning it starts from the aortic arch and goes to the top of the skull.
And that was done at 8:33 p.m.?
That's correct.
Then the second?
The second one was a CT of what we call the maxillofacial region. It just means the face. It basically goes from the chin to the vertex or to the top of the skull.
And then one the following, I guess 3 o'clock in the morning, the following morning, so roughly, 6 hours later.
That's correct, yes.
And what was that?
That's a non-contrast CT head, so instead of, unlike the one where it's a CT angiography, where we actually administer contrast through a vein, we didn't administer any contrast in this case.
And why did you do that one as well?
That was to follow up for multiple intracranial bleeds.
Angiocranial.
Intracranial, meaning inside the,
Can you say the word?
intracranial bleeds.
I want to talk about B first, the face. Did you notice any injuries on the slides, on the CT scans with that technology? Could you see injuries inflicted in the face of Brenda Welch?
Yes.
Would you describe them for us before we get to it?
Sure. So there were multiple fractures, and when it comes to fractures, I think it's probably best to talk about a fracture complex. So going back to the analogy of the egg, it's very difficult to drop an egg, for example, and not have it shatter or parts of it shatter into multiple pieces. So that's kind of how fractures usually occur. Although it's true with like long bones, for example, the wrist, that you can have kind of a linear fracture. In the skull and face, usually it's more of a crumpling, and there's multiple different components. So we talk about fracture complexes as opposed to single fracture. I mean, essentially it was most of the time we can say this was derived from a single blow. So for example, we see lots of cases where somebody's punched in the nose. Usually, it can result in a single fracture, but most of the time it's several fractures, but it still involves that same area of the nose. So in this case, there were, and then, I'm sorry, we also use a term called comminuted, which just means that there's multiple components to it. We also talk about things like depressed, meaning that the bone itself has been pushed back. And so in this case, there were comminuted, or essentially bilateral nasal bones and nasal bridge. Multiple fragments of bone were fractured, and it was depressed. And it involved, like I said, the nasal bridge and nasal bones.
Comminuted, is that a clean break or multiple breaks?
That's multiple breaks.
And Brenda, you found had, in essence, multiple breaks, comminuted fractures.
That's correct.
Did you notice anything else in her face, any other injuries?
So she also had a fracture over her left, basically frontal bone. So the frontal bone extends to the eyebrow, and she had a fracture right above the eyebrow. And it was also comminuted and depressed. And so that's...
The images you said that the CT scan gets is in essence starts as sort of a two-dimensional issue when you can turn it into, you can make it three-dimensional?
That's correct. The X-ray source is like a fan, so basically, the radiation is spread out like a fan, and it essentially gives you a slice-by-slice area, or in this case, we scanned helically, which just means that it's a continual spiral as the table moves.
Let me show you the next slide, number 48, I believe. Yeah. Are these the slices you're talking about?
Yes.
And you've got arrows up here, and you've got 4 images. I'm going to ask you to walk us through, teach us what you learned from this. I've given you a laser pointer.
Sure.
And to the extent it's more comfortable for you, if you want to walk down here and do it, or stand, sit there, whatever you're more comfortable with. But just teach us what this shows us.
So these are, I'll walk you through slowly. These are sequential, which means that they were acquired one right after the other, or essentially they're slices that are acquired one right next to each other. And if you will, this is essentially right here, the side of the head, and we're actually slicing in this plane, meaning, if you will, basically running back to the head. So so basically your knowledge of anatomy might be difficult to understand exactly where this is, but it's the side of what's called the temporal bone. And what I've just illustrated is just like you'd see with an egg fracturing, you can see that there's multiple linear areas of defects. And so, normal bone should look like the center part of this where it's all white. But instead we have these black lines that those are essentially the fractures themselves. I've simply color-coded them to illustrate that they propagate into different regions, or essentially they move or continue into different regions of the skull. And if we were to continue this out over additional images, you'd see, the extent of the fractures.
So, by that big word that started with P, does that teach us the depth of it, in essence?
Well, so the skull is made up of, I didn't want to necessarily go into this detail, but the skull is made up of both an outer table and an inner table. It means that there's cortex on the outside and the inside, and in between is marrow cavity. So this tells us that the fracture started on the outer cortex, which is called the outer table, and then extends to and is a full thickness. In other words, the fracture extends to the inside of the skull, the inner portion of the skull as well. So the analogy to an egg is actually a little bit wrong in the sense that, sure. The analogy to an egg is really that we have almost 2 eggshells to cover our brain, if you will.
And the fact that it's this deep, this much, and comminuted, does that teach you anything about the amount of force that may have been used to cause this?
Yes.
What does it teach us?
Well, so it tells us that this is, if you were putting it in a spectrum, this was something that was not just this is unlikely to be a punch to the head, for example. It can happen, but it's unlikely. And this is likely to be a blow from something that's more forceful than that.
So more forceful than a punch in the head?
Yes.
And can you tell us if this is something that could require a minimal amount of force or a significant amount of force, use whatever spectrum you want?
So this would be something that could occur. Just for example, this couldn't occur from a blow from a pencil, for example. It couldn't occur from a ruler. This is something more forceful than that. It could occur from a blunt object, maybe a stick, a bat, for example, could give you this kind of injury. Even if you fell, for example, on a brick, that would be the same thing. But this is a direct blow to something that was pretty hard substance and pretty forceful.
Were you able to take this image and create, in essence, a more recognizable three-dimensional image?
Yes. So we took.
Would that be the next slide here?
Yes.
Okay, let's do that. And this would be number 40.
What's the number on the back?
50.
Thank you. So tell us what we're looking at here.
So these are volume rendered images, or essentially they're just a volumetric reconstruction. We took that data that we acquired from the CT, and we simply reconstructed the bones themselves. So this is direct. This is actually her skull, and essentially derived from her CT exam. And so I've highlighted it with the arrows here just the extent and or areas of fracture. So for example, this is that area over the left frontal bone. And just so you know, by radiologic convention, we always call the left the opposite of what you'd see because you're looking at the patient. And so in this case, we're looking at the patient, so this is their left. Right there is that fracture. And as you can see, it really extends from something called the, let's just say the frontal bone. Essentially it goes up and extends and crosses over the eye, and even crosses the midline and goes to the other side a little bit.
What does that teach us?
Well, so this is most likely related to a blow from the side of the head, just because there's impact or displacement of this bone relative to the other bone, and the fracture mechanism itself and the propagation.
And the blow to the face, to the nose area, and the side of the head have been the same blow.
It would be incredibly unlikely to be the same because of the direction of forces.
Let me go to the next photograph, number 51. Let me start with, you said that you're concerned about safety in not exposing CT patients to too much radiation. How does that relate to this little cutout you see here?
Right. So this is so what we've done here is this is again her skull, but what we've done is we've essentially preserved or used less radiation, which is why you see a hole here. That's not a hole in her skull. That's essentially a hole in our data set. We stopped acquiring so we wouldn't expose her to unnecessary radiation.
Okay. But on the arrows on the right side of that, what does that demonstrate for you?
So this is that right temporal bone, or essentially the right side of the skull again. And these are just the comminuted fractures. This was actually the same image or the reconstruction of the same data that I showed you on those sagittal images that we saw where we talked about the egg. So these are the same fractures, and you can just see them a little bit better. You can see kind of these jagged lines, the dark jagged lines here, both in the red arrow. The yellow arrow represents a separate fracture, and these are just extensions of the fracture itself. And then this is the normal side for comparison. So these are sutures. Those are normal findings, but otherwise the bone looks pretty smooth here, unlike this side.
And again, to be clear, this isn't a representation. This is actually Brenda Welch.
This is her. This is her skull.
We go to the next one, number 52, please. And what does this show us?
So this is just a slightly different obliquity, or essentially we've just turned the head a little. Obliquity, that's correct. We've just turned the head just a little bit to show different areas a little bit better. So these are the same fracture lines I showed you in the prior image. I'm just highlighting this little bony defect right here, and highlighted by the yellow arrows. That represents what we call a buccal fracture. It just means that so instead of the fracture going in or out, it actually just buckles on itself. So, and you can see that the bones here actually protrude outward. So that tells you that the force likely came from behind and then was transmitted forward across the skull. So in other words, she probably was hit or had impact in the posterior area of the skull.
When you say hit in the behind, that she would have been hit from behind?
Well, I can't tell you exactly what happened. I can simply tell you that that's the mechanism of the injury.
We go to number 53, I believe, the next one. And that, is this back to the two-dimensional image?
That is correct.
Okay.
So that is an axial slice. Essentially what we've done now is we're just basically taking a cut this way through the head. And this is illustrating this left frontal bone fracture. And you can see there's multiple fracture lines here. There's 1, 2, 3, so it's comminuted. There's depression of this bone relative to the others. So it's a depressed fracture. And unlike the one in the temporal bone on this side, this one does not involve that inner table or the inside of the skull. It's just the outside.
What does depressed fracture mean, and what does that teach us?
Well, again, a depressed fracture just tells you that the bone itself was pushed inward, which is a fairly common thing to occur in the skull, and tells you again that this is not an insignificant force, meaning it was something that was substantial.
Next, number 54, please. No, they're just like that out, so.
Okay, so this is
I believe this is 54. Right.
this is number 54.
What are we looking at?
So this is another axial image, and the before was a little bit higher.
Okay, good. Where are the eyes?
Yep, I was just going to say, so the eyes, now we're here, these are the eyes themselves here, so we're at a level just above, just a little bit from the middle of the eyes, a little bit higher. And so you can see the multiple comminuted fractures of the temporal bone here that I mentioned before, those 4 arrows. And then these are just illustrating some of her nasal bridge fracture, and this actually is another fracture that's called the lamina papyricia. Please don't ask me to spell that, but it's it's just a bone that lines that essentially is part of the skull itself.
And what is that? You've got these arrows. What are they?
Those are just depicting the fractures themselves. So again, these areas of essentially dark
And
areas.
can you point on your head, if you will?
Sure.
where
So
those are?
the nasal bridge is essentially here, and then the temporal bone is essentially here.
Okay. And that's what's, and each of those are the fractures that we're looking at.
Right. And this other fracture here I can't point to, that's obviously beneath the eyeball.
All right, next image, please. And this would be number 55.
55.
Again, the eyeballs, and this is, if I could borrow the image, the patient be down, sort of, as I'm holding this styrofoam head in that position, and looking that way.
That's correct, yes. So we're cutting through essentially at the level of the eyes, right?
Okay. Go ahead.
And this simply demonstrates I mentioned the word propagation, but that just means that it continues along the same areas. In other words, it's, if you break a piece of glass, for example, you can just know that maybe you had an impact at one place, but then the fracture, or essentially the break itself continues, extends somewhere else. So that just means it extends. So these arrows here in the yellow are highlighting 2 fractures of the nasal bridge and are extending into the nasal bones. And then there's multiple fractures here that are part of that complex that I mentioned of the right temporal bone.
And number 56, is that similar?
That's 56.
Yeah.
So 56, what I've done here is I've simply placed an arrow on every identifiable fracture itself. So you can just see the number of arrows, that's the number of fractures in her bilateral nasal bones. So you can see it affects both sides. Here's that area of the anterior right temporal bone. That is the area that buckled. I mentioned it buckled on the volumetric reformats or the volumetric images. And then here's just part of that, again, temporal bone fracture complex extending inferiorly, or extending below.
Just one more.
The last arrow you were at.
This one?
Yeah.
This is part of the temporal bone fracture complex
What you were saying.
that extends inferiorly or lower down.
And number 57, please.
So this is another axial image acquired a little bit lower. Now we're at the level of the earlobes. You can actually see the earlobes here. on the sides, right here. And this is actually her external auditory canal, or essentially the ear hole. There's multiple fractures in the ear hole itself. There's 1 and 2. And then there's a fracture that transmits through the temporal bone, so that the bone right behind the ear, which is this, sometimes you might feel this little bump here, that's that bone. And there's a longitudinal fracture, essentially one that goes the length of the bone itself deep into the skull. And that's this area here.
And remind us, because this is on the left side of the image, does that mean it's on the right side of her head?
That's correct, yes.
So this would be her right ear that's impacted?
Yes.
And the right temple?
Yes.
Then what does that teach us about impact?
Well, again, this suggests that there's quite a lot of force that was delivered to this area.
Let's talk about the other head injuries, and we'll do that on 58. What does it show us?
Okay. So unlike the slices that we already saw, where one was sagittal and one was axial, now we're doing a coronal slice, so essentially we're putting the
Hold on. We were doing pretty good there.
Sorry.
So, sagittal. Tell us what it means.
So sagittal essentially this way.
Okay.
Okay. That's the slice. The slice is acquired this way.
So,
That's axial.
okay.
That's sagittal that way. Coronal is up and down.
Okay.
So we're going this way.
So, that way.
Yes, that way.
So, tell us what number 58 teaches us.
So this is again just showing the propagation of that. I mentioned that fracture in basically this part of the temporal bone behind the ear. It's showing propagation of that fracture, or essentially continuation of that fracture from the outside all the way into the inside of what we call the intracranial content. So essentially it reaches the brain. That's what that tells us. And then the yellow arrow here is again identifying that other fracture complex that was a little bit higher in the temporal bone. Same things illustrated on this image, just a different slice. So we're moving through the head in this plane.
Have you seen people who come in with injuries and a history of a fall?
Yes.
And a fall from a standing position to the ground?
Yes.
A few times, hundreds of times, thousands of times?
I would say we see at least 3 to 5 every day.
Have you ever seen injuries like this, from somebody just falling over?
No.
Let's go to this number 59, please. That's the CT, and this is the one from the following morning, or, well, I guess 3 in the morning.
Yes, this is from 3 to 1.
Okay. And now, number 60. What is, again, show us either on our styrofoam head, on my head, on your head,
Sure.
where you're talking about. No, whichever's easier for you.
Okay. So these images are acquired axially, so they're basically again in this plane here. So we're essentially taking out plane through the head this way. And we're at the level of, we're above the ears, and you can see that because we don't see ears on the side here. So we're essentially about this level right here.
And what is that? Actually, let me show this. You're above the ears. Let me show you a photograph that's been admitted as exhibit number 4. And you see some lacerations and scars to the patient in that photo?
Yeah.
Is that the area you're talking about?
We're probably around this level. So the area of laceration is probably just slightly above.
Step out of the way so it's secure.
So we're talking about a level right here, right below the area of laceration.
And what do you see in her skull, in this general area here, that's shown on this CT scan of yours?
So actually, so there are the staples that you can see from the image. So one of those is actually at the level, or includes some of those staples at the level of her laceration, and you can see those right here.
Let me stop a minute.
Yeah.
You work at Harborview.
Yes.
Did you come to learn that the patient, between the first two images in the 1 to 3 in the morning, had some surgery? Or it had some interventions at some point?
No.
Okay. What do you mean by staples?
So lacerations are commonly treated with skin staples. There's essentially the skin is stapled together.
That's what I meant by intervention. That's meaningful to us. Staples to the head.
Sorry.
So staples would have been medically...
Yes, these are medically administered staples to prevent the wound, or essentially close the wound temporarily. It's a common temporizing measure.
Okay. And so you're very used to seeing those?
We see, yes.
Okay. But it's not some external...
This is not something that occurred from before she got to the hospital.
Perfect. Okay. Now that we understand that, walk us through what we've got here.
So I've highlighted this in arrows just to make this easy to see, but what we have is this area of bright here. So first of all, this area that is the band of bright all the way around the skull, so essentially is the skull itself. So that's the skull. This here is somewhat of a lens shaped, where it's essentially like this, essentially the shape. That is blood, and that's acute blood, and we can tell it's acute because of it's bright, and we can tell that this has happened within I'd say 6 to 12 hours before. And then this is just showing another level. So again, another axial slice at just a different level, just showing that it's not just on one image, but it's on several. It actually extends along much of her brain. And this is consistent with an epidural hematoma. What that means is, so epidural hematomas are classically lens-shaped, and they also are classically arise from fractures. And it tells you that the fracture went, again, through the outside of the skull and also to the inside and then reached the brain itself. So it impacted the brain. And then this red line that I've drawn here is just to show you that already there is what we call midline shift. In other words, the structures, that little line right there in the gray, I don't know if you can see that. That's a structure that normally should be perfectly in the midline, just like your nose. But instead it's already starting to be pushed to the side because of the mass effect from this blood.
You used the word acute.
Oh.
Is that a medical term meaning recent?
That means recent, yes.
And what does it teach you that there is this accumulation of blood in the brain sufficient to cause the shifting of the brain?
Well, this becomes a medical emergency because if this continues, she will herniate. Her brain will herniate and will, she'll basically, the risk is either brain death or death itself. So we take this very seriously.
And what does it teach you that there is this amount of blood in the brain as far as what would cause that?
So generally speaking, the greater the force, the larger the blood. And there are other areas of blood here. She actually has a subdural hematoma on the left side, which is just another type of blood, another area, for example, where blood accumulates. And then this wispy material in the background here, especially here, those areas, and also here, that actually is subarachnoid blood, which is yet another space of kind of just outside the brain that has blood. So there's blood in 3 different compartments of her intracranial space.
You said that the amount of blood is significant. Now, you're used to seeing this, we're not. Is this a little bit or a whole lot? Or,
This is a lot.
and the more blood, in essence, the more blood, the more force?
So it's not always quite that way, but in general, there are some fractures that cross some specific areas that can cause this amount of blood from a lesser degree, but the key thing is that it reaches the inner table, and so in order to get that fracture, it obviously has to have enough force to get to that level.
If the head is hit with sufficient force, can the brain sort of shift to one side and bump up against The other side of the skull?
Yes.
What's that called?
That's called a coup contra coup injury.
And do you see evidence of that?
So it's difficult to say because there are fractures both on the left frontal area and there's fractures in the right temporal area, which is that almost coup contra coup. So you have almost different opposing forces. So it would be difficult to say that this is definitely a contra coup injury, but I wouldn't be able to exclude it. It could represent that. But that would imply that you had a single blow and a single fracture.
And the fact that there's blood in these other parts, what does that teach you?
That just tells me that this is significant force.
From your, and I have one more slide here, I believe, number 61. And I'll ask you to look at that.
Sure, so this is, again, axial images. We're getting close to the ears. You can see just the very tip of the ear here. So we're talking about literally this level here, right at the tip of the ear. And the reason why I picked this image is because you can see that, so there's quite a lot of what's called cerebral edema, meaning her brain is swelling from trauma. And she's starting to actually herniate. She's actually undergoing what's called axial herniation, that the brain is starting to sag or essentially push down inferiorly, essentially downward.
The brain is heading into the neck, into the spine.
Exactly.
That sounds like that. Is that a concern?
Absolutely.
Could from what you saw, could the injuries to the nose and the injuries to the head have been caused by the same single blow?
It would be incredibly unlikely.
Doctor, those are the only questions I want to ask you. Thanks for answering my questions.
Thank you for cross-examination. Do you wish the lights on?
Yes, please.
So, Dr. Andre, you testified that there were essentially 3 sets of images that were taken of Ms. Welch. Is that right?
That's correct.
And those were taken over the period of November 16th and November 17th, 2014?
Yes.
Okay. And did you review those within that same time frame? Is that right?
Yes.
Would it be accurate that you haven't reviewed those essentially? Well, let me strike that. Once you completed that process of reviewing those for the patient, did you have any more, did you provide any more patient care?
To that patient?
To that patient?
Yeah.
Okay. And so you reviewed these in preparation for your testimony today, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. But otherwise you wouldn't have taken a look at them since November of 2014?
That's correct.
Okay. And in your practice, you don't frequently meet the patients that you are reviewing the images of?
That's correct.
Okay. And in this case, you didn't actually meet Ms. Welch?
I did not.
Okay. Now, your testimony along with the slides, we saw, I don't know how many images, maybe 20, 25 images here. Would that be somewhat accurate?
20.
20. You did them, so you know, 20 images. And you would agree that the images which were taken and that were shown often showed the same thing but from a different angle. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And it's your testimony, the way you describe the types of fractures is that it wouldn't be really medically correct to talk about in the terms of one fracture because they develop into sort of smaller multiple fractures coming off. Is that somewhat right?
In terms of in terms of a region, meaning an area. So if you think about Europe versus the U.S., it's unlikely that a fracture in Europe is going to propagate to the U.S. That's
Okay.
correct.
So you talk about a fracture complex or a distinct fracture pattern, or is that sort of the terms that you use to
Yes.
describe distinct areas?
Yes.
Okay. And so you've talked about a distinct area over the eye, is that right?
Yes.
And you've talked about a distinct fracture area over the nose and bridge. That would be one in of itself, is that correct?
The nose and, right, well, so it's difficult for us to differentiate between one blow, regardless of what the, what the cause is, and multiple blows to the same area. Meaning I can't tell you if the nasal fracture was one blow or 5.
Okay.
But it was, that area was distinct from the temporal bone.
Okay. So, right. So you in the work that you do, you can't say exactly how a person was injured, correct?
No, I can't tell you exactly what happened.
Okay. But you can say that the fractures on the bridge and on the nose is one fracture pattern.
That is, we presume it's one fracture pattern, again, meaning that I can tell you it could have occurred from one blow, it could have occurred from 5, but I can't differentiate one from the other.
And in your estimation, that is a separate and distinct fracture pattern from what was from the eye area, is that right?
It's possible, for example, that if someone fell onto a concrete floor, face down, that you could get that fracture pattern of nose and from the frontal bone. But the thing that would make it unusual is that the frontal bone is the fracture mechanism, or the force, if you will, seems to come from the side,
Okay.
which would suggest two discrete or different mechanisms.
Okay, so based on it appearing as though the force came from the side, you believe that they're distinct, but you can't say that conclusively.
I cannot say that conclusively.
Okay. And then moving on to the fractures on her head, you've identified a fracture or a fracture pattern on the right side of her head, is that
That's
correct?
correct, yes.
And there's also a fracture on the left side of her head, is that correct?
Yes.
Fracture pattern, you should say. And it's possible that the fracture from the left side of the head, the fracture pattern could have been caused by the force that created the fracture pattern on the right side of the head.
Absolutely not.
Well,
That
a
is-
moment ago we were talking about, and I'm going to likely say this incorrectly,
Sure.
contra Q.
Yes.
And so,
So let me explain that in a little detail. The contra Q injury is an injury to the brain and or the blood itself, but fractures don't propagate. In other words, there's no fracture that traces the one side of the head to the other side. And that's why they absolutely have to be two separate blows.
okay, so it's not possible at all that the fracture on the left side of the head is fracture pattern is related to the fracture pattern on the right side of the head.
Not in this case.
Okay. Now, in your work, there are times when you can make a determination about what causes a fracture, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And you can't make that kind of determination in this case.
No.
Okay. Now, you testified that it would be unlikely the fractures occurred because of a fall. Is that correct?
That's true.
Okay. And that the force that would need to be used would be, or I should say, so if you don't, my questions may not always be eloquent, but if you let me ask one and then you can answer them, thank you. And you hypothesize that there would need to be something more deliberate that would have to be used in order to create these fracture patterns, is that correct?
I would prefer to use a different term.
Okay.
It's not that they necessarily need to be deliberate, it's just that, for example, if somebody fell from a 2-story building, that might explain the fracture pattern in the face or the temporal bone, but not both, because they would have to land with, in theory, like bricks on either side of their head, for example. It would be incredibly unusual and unlikely to have both those fracture mechanisms from two seemingly disparate force mechanisms would cause that fracture.
Okay.
But a single fracture in and of itself could occur from, like I said, a fall from a two-story building. But fall from standing would be incredibly unlikely to have that fracture mechanism.
Hypothetically, if somebody were in a construction zone and something heavy were to fall on them, that could potentially cause the fracture patterns we're seeing in this case.
Sure. If they fell on the side of their head and you'd have the fracture on the one side and something fell on the other side, that would be possible.
Okay. And in your opinion, it's not realistic, you can't realistically determine exactly what kind of object was used in this case?
No, I cannot.
Okay. And you also can't say in your estimation, in your opinion, what type of weight would be necessary in order for these to have occurred?
So that we can say a little bit about, and it has to do with, again, the fractures and the depth of the fractures and the way they look. So, this injury was not caused by a knife, for example. A knife would give you a penetrating injury. The fracture mechanism, if there were a fracture, would be very different. And the knife as an instrument for blows, just because we've seen so many at Harborview, that could not have caused this. There were no significant lacerations in the way that a blade would be used. But like I said before, bludgeoning, for example, with some device could have caused this. Brick. I don't know.
Okay, so it's a spectrum. You were indicated before,
Yes, it is a
something heavier than a pen or a pencil, but you don't know exactly where on the range that might be. Just one moment.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Yeah, and that would partly depend on how hard someone was swinging.
Whatever on this.
Sure.
Doctor, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate you all for your I'll take these from you.
And I have no further questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Sorry.
You may step down here, excuse. All right, folks, that'll take care of our morning session. We'll take our afternoon break at this point in time. Please put the cover over your notebooks. Leave those in the jury room. They will be secured. Remember my admonition about not talking about this case with anyone. Please do not remain within hearing of anyone talking about it. I do have a 1 o'clock matter in this courtroom that I anticipate will probably take 15 minutes or so. If I could have you start gathering in the jury room about 5 to 1. If I'm in session, don't worry about coming in. I want you in here to come through. You're not going to disturb me. It happens every day. Just walk right through here and back into the jury room. Okay? And I'll try and get started.
I have sentencing as well. It shouldn't take very long. I just want to give you that heads up.
All right. So we will, anything with the defense? We'll start. We'll try and get going around 1:20 or so or thereabouts as close. But if I can get you started gathering in about 5 to 1, okay? Thank you very much. Recess. Have a good lunch.
All right.